Welcome to Psych Sessions on Teaching and Learning Centers. My name is Chris Hackala, and I'm your podcast host. In this series of conversations, we speak with folks who have made the leap from a traditional faculty member position to a role in a center for teaching and learning. The conversations focus on how individuals moved from faculty to a center and how that move impacted their work, their career trajectory, and their personal and professional identity. Along the way, we talk about tips, advice, and challenges that come from working in a center. Sit back and enjoy these chats on Psych Sessions on Teaching and Learning Centers. And all right, so I am happy to be here today with Cassandra Horii, who is the Associate Vice Provost for Education and Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Stanford University. Cassandra, thanks so much for talking to me today and sharing some of your insight. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Chris, I'm glad to be here. The series that you're working on, delving into the origins of folks who are in the field of educational development at Centers for Teaching and Learning, is a great contribution. I'm just really glad to get a chance to talk with you.
Oh, great. I appreciate that. It's been really fun. I've talked to a lot of people, and one of the really cool things that's come out of this is that there really is no direct path that's easily identifiable for people going into faculty development. They all come from different backgrounds. Everybody's got a unique story. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how you ended up where you are, starting. And I like to start back because it's always interesting to me. If you start at undergrad and sort of talk through your academic pedigree, that'd be great.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I might just rewind a little bit before undergrad.
That's great.
That's all right.
Absolutely.
Because it was, actually in my high school years that I had that spark of inclination and fascination toward the process of teaching and learning.
Wow.
And it came about through a really odd, interesting, I think, piece of my background that actually not a lot of people know. I got very interested and excited in learning French in what was then junior high and high school, and very much took to it, really enjoyed the language, went as far as I could in my high school classes and took a couple AP classes in French. And during the summers for several years, I worked at a French language immersion camp as a counselor, the Concordia Language Villages up in Minnesota. And that experience of getting, a fresh group of campers for my small group that I was leading in these very, what we would now call active learning, right? Learning experiences to get excited about the language through songs and games and all kinds of creative endeavors. Just got me hooked on this kind of lesson planning process and the creativity involved in really figuring out how to get folks interested and engaged, how to help them through challenges, right? Because a lot of these very beginning language speakers were immersed, nevertheless. They were, 24/7 suddenly living life in the French language. So that got me hooked. And I think that never really went away, just that joy of figuring out how to approach a piece of learning, carrying that out with a group of people, and then just seeing the resulting, spark of excitement.
So before you go any further, this is fascinating to me, and it's fascinating to me for a number of levels. One of which is, so I suspect you're fluent in French.
I was fluent at a point, and I am way out of practice. So I'll ask you not to make me embarrassed.
No. I'm not going to ask
any pronunciation right now. But yeah, I was quite fluent for a time. And in college, I steered more toward studying the sciences. So I was a physics major. One of the things that was challenging about that was actually that it took so many of my credits up to study physics that there wasn't a lot of time for other, language and exploration. So I took some French in college. And then I got a little frustrated that I actually didn't have much time to study English literature in English, right? Or American literature, or be writing in English, because I certainly wasn't doing that in my physics classes in the early 1990s. Maybe that's changed a little bit now.
Not much.
So I didn't do the double major or minor in French. I took a lot of other classes and got a kind of breadth of experience, which was also good.
Yeah, it's just interesting because, and I wasn't going to ask you to speak French because that always feels a little bit like you're on the spot. But I'm curious about it only because For two reasons. One, my training as a psychologist is actually as a psycholinguist. So I'm fascinated with people who can tackle and learn another language. I think it's really interesting from a cognitive perspective. It looks like it should be cognitively challenging, but depending on when you learn it, it's not as challenging. So I think that's really interesting. The other piece, and this is a personal piece, but my wife is a speech pathologist, but she respecialized as an ESL teacher a few years ago and works with ESL students. And what she does is a lot of what you were describing with French, but she's doing that with English and with students who speak vastly different languages from vastly different language families. So I guess I just wanted to sort of comment on, I appreciate the complexity of that, as how challenging it is to get students, depending on the age, to recognize the similarity and intention and meaning behind these symbols, yet you have to use different symbols based on the language. So I just think it's really interesting, and what great practice for an early scholar in a discipline like a STEM discipline where translation is actually necessary, and we'll come back to that, to learn how to do that. So I think that's a super cool sort of story that you did that, and also kind of a fun way for you to go through your high school years. So I think that's just kind of cool. And then you gravitated towards the sciences in college. And where did you go?
Yeah, I was at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Okay. Boulder's also where I grew up for most of my formative years prior to college. I was a first-gen college student as a young woman at that time, coming up through junior high school, being, fairly decent at math and science. I also got a lot of encouragement in that direction. Mm-hmm. And it was the time when we were just figuring out the ozone hole puzzle, which was very compelling. And a lot of that work was happening in Boulder. So there was a great deal of excitement surrounding some of the basic sciences. I gravitated to physics because it seemed like a challenge, honestly. And I think I learned later on that kind of fierce independence of many first-gen college students, right? Really, really approaching college as feeling like, we have something to prove about right? Being there, being capable, doing it on our own. So I did not recognize that pattern in myself until much later, but definitely had that kind of approach to picking a major and trying to be successful at it. So while I was studying physics, I also did some summer research as an undergrad. Again, something I found my way into without knowing it was a thing. One of those high impact practices, right, that got me into atmospheric science. I was lucky, though, at the University of Colorado Boulder to have taken an honors course with Dr. Marianne Shea, who led a faculty teaching excellence program. So basically a Center for Teaching and Learning and Educational Development program for faculty, and ended up doing an honors thesis with her supervision. So I went kind of outside of physics. And again, at the time, the literature on inequities in undergraduate STEM education was kind of just maturing. There was a lot more available at that time. I think there was more that had been studied about gender inequities than we understand today about race, socioeconomic status, first gen, right? We understand a lot more now. But at that time, we read some of Sheila Tobias's work. On experiences in undergraduate education. And I will say that helped me make sense of my experience in physics. And I think it came together with that sort of developing understanding of processes of learning and teaching. So I think that helped me persist in what was not a very teaching focus, certainly was not emphasizing active learning, and was pretty inequitable, a pretty inequitable environment at that time.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about first gen, and it's a number of people I've spoken with are in your same position, went through college as a first gen. And I think what that does is what you're describing is it creates this sort of, I don't know if it's fierce independent. I don't know the right way to describe it, but it's this, I need to do this for reasons that are idiosyncratic to who we are. And it leads to different outcomes for different people. And what I really like about your story is you were able to turn it and recognize not just the piece of physics, but those other things about how perhaps other people, even within your family line, could have done this kind of work given opportunities and given the chance to experience these kinds of things. I think that's one of the biggest things about the inequities that exist in our educational system right now, is that we don't know what could have happened because so many people were shut out for all kinds of reasons. And so I think it's a really cool kind of way to think about it. And I have a dear friend of mine who is a biology faculty, well, now a dean, but was a biology faculty member in California. And she worked, and she had a lot of Latina women that were in her lab studying spiders that she brought into the biological sciences. And it was really sort of her mission to really expose this area to a wide range of people and give them access to that kind of thing. And I think seeing people like you and her out there, I think really does help begin to see, we see that things are changing, but boy, it's a slow process, Cassandra. It's a slow process. So I appreciate that kind of work that you were doing and that you experienced. And I'll say one more thing and I'll shut up. The first gen college student thing, that's really, it's such a real thing for so many of our students, and we still need to pay attention to it because there are huge inequities. And I dare say the first gen, non-first gen inequity is bigger now than it was 30 years ago. I don't have empirical data, but I feel like that there's even a bigger gap, at least I'm seeing in my students.
Interesting, Chris. Yeah, the processes of change, when I now look back to the early 90s and look at, we've come very far in some ways, but there are pieces that we are still working on that are the same today. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure we'll get to that kind of like change talk at some point in our conversation. And I look forward to it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So picking up in undergrad, overall, frustrating experience in some ways in physics. I got through it and helpful to have that kind of complementary experience to really think about what was happening in science education. And I decided to go to grad school and go into the field that I'd been working on summers and kind of these side undergraduate research projects, which was atmospheric science. And during the process, because I had worked with that center at CU Boulder, I kind of had it on my radar, which I think is pretty unusual that these places existed at universities and especially at research universities. And it was actually something that I looked for in my graduate visits. I knew that, I wanted to go get my PhD. I also knew that I wanted opportunities to teach. And so I remember distinctly in those visits and interviews, trying to subtly ask the question like, hey, what's teaching like in the department? Do you get a chance? Do you not get a chance? And definitely heard from some places, oh, we're not encouraged to teach. You only do it if you have to. And in other places, there was more flexibility. Maybe it depended on the advisor. So I went to Harvard and I was in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science. And I knew there was the Derek Bach Center for Teaching and Learning. And I connected with them pretty early. So I did some of their programs as I was a first-time teaching assistant. And at some point, I think I knocked on the door and said, here I am, what else can I do, right? And so, I did some more of the programs, but I also was like a graduate teaching consultant. I had a fantastic advisor at Harvard, Stephen Wofsy, who's jointly in engineering and applied science and earth and planetary science, who also was very open to talking about the courses he was teaching in what was at the time the core curriculum, as well as in the department. And we cooked up some fun projects together. So after, I was a teaching assistant there, they call them teaching fellows at Harvard. So I was a teaching fellow for one of the core courses. And Steve was frustrated with the project in that course. So we cooked up what would be a different way to approach that project. At at the start, it didn't necessarily have a lot of like scaffolding leading up to it. It was kind of one of these big papers that come at the end. You didn't have a draft, you didn't have a revision. And so we ended up developing, with input from the Harvard Writing Project, a kind of a new curriculum for that course that got students reading the primary literature. And these were mostly non-science students, reading some of the primary literature, really understanding what the parts of a scientific paper were, what to look for, how to read in a particular way, and then synthesizing in steps toward that final paper. And we were pretty happy with the results of that. So we got to do some fun curriculum development. I got to do some fun curriculum development projects along the way in graduate school.
Yeah, and that experience, I think that what's interesting is if I look at commonality across people, and it's minimal. One thing I do see is an interest early on in teaching beyond just having to sort of do it. And many of the people I've talked to had some kind of contact with the Teaching and Learning Center somewhere. And I think that your experience is kind of interesting and unique in that you actually worked with an experienced faculty member and designed this study and this project and did that. And I think that's a credit to the person you worked with, but also a credit to you to say, hey, let's try this out. Let's talk this through and let's think about this. We can see this one teaching learning issue is a problem. What can we do to fix that? And one of my mentors and someone name you may or may not know, a person named Victor Benassi. He's at University of New Hampshire. Victor and I have worked on a couple of projects together, and his center, and he retired a couple of years ago, that's all they do is they work with faculty on research projects, science and learning research projects. Then that's sort of a model for how they do it. And I think that model in some institutions works really well because it jives with faculty, but it addresses complex issues in teaching and learning in a way that makes sense. So I think that's really cool what you did, by the way. That's a long way of me saying I thought that's really cool and fun for you to get that experience early on in your career. So I think that's just great.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, it was a good experience to have. And I look back and I kind of wonder sometimes at the boldness. I guess I just have not had a problem with saying like, hey, maybe we could. And often that's worked out. Yeah. To give things a try and see if we might approach things somewhat differently. So I think we're entering the final chapter of how did I get to this field of educational development, which is toward the end of grad school, right? So I really looked at, do I want to, go on the path of a tenure track faculty position? I think I had all the pieces and very well could have applied and gone that route. I also thought about what I was most passionate about. And it came down to that kind of pull, right, of what I was most excited about. I very much advocate for work-life balance, but I have framed it at the time as that question of like, well, what do I not mind spending my weekend reading about that has something to do with my potential future work? And that was all about the educational work of higher ed. So I was pretty specific at that point about thinking through what I needed to do to be effective in roles that would help transform, change, improve how we do the education part of higher education. And I realized at that point that I had taught quantitative subjects and I had not taught text-based and really thoroughly discussion-based kinds of subjects before. So having done that work with the Harvard Writing Project, I applied to teach expository writing, expos, full time. And, they gave me a chance. We'd worked on that curriculum project, so I had some of the pedagogical knowledge about composition and rhetoric and how to teach in an effective way. And I did that for several years in order to really gain this kind of immersive experience in a very different kind of teaching. I think at the time I looked at centers for teaching and learning, and although now there are more positions that specialize disciplinarily, at the time, I think more people were more generalists in CTL, so although they were bringing their own disciplinary background, they also would work across disciplines with faculty, graduate teaching assistants, and others at the university setting. So that was a fantastic experience as well. So I taught for several years, and then when an opening happened at the Derek Bach Center at Harvard, I think I had all the pieces and was very lucky to then move into an associate director role. And I really haven't looked back. I have not regretted any of those choices along the way. As you can hear, they were intentional. They were very much connected with my deep interests and sort of fascination in the world, sense of purpose. And I think also over this past 20-year period, it's a time of great, import. Higher ed faces some real challenges, and I think we need people to focus on those things and be able to partner and collaborate. And that's just work that I've very much enjoyed doing.
So you went from the Bach Center to Horii College. Is that right?
Yeah. That's right.
So, and that transition was, I'd be curious to hear how that happened, but it's an interesting transition because it looked like you went from an associate director to a director position. Is that correct?
So the position at Horii College was a bit different. It was dean of faculty.
Okay.
Yeah, and the intent was for that dean, the person in that role, to start some sort of a center for faculty. And I did that and very much loved working with the folks at Horii College. I think although appreciating my experience at Harvard, I've also kind of graded against the elitism. And, you can tell from my career path that I've been in and out of different institutions along that kind of ranking spectrum in terms of reputation. And what I think is important to me in any role is that we recognize the joint effort, the collaborative effort of higher education today. I think institutions have roles to play. Variety of mission is a very good thing. And I never want to be insular about that. So it helps to talk to people at similar institutions. I think it also really helps to connect with people at very different institutions, because from that, we have an opportunity to find the deeper ideas and principles of positive educational change across different superficial features, right? So we can think about analogical encoding or something like that on this kind of grander scale where we're trying to understand how to make a difference in institutions and what strategies. The facets of those strategies will look quite different depending on the place. But I think there are some deeper core ideas, and it's just helpful to have that sort of exchange across different institutions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's always fascinating to talk to folks from vastly different institutions and to get their perspective on how not only the work they do is carried out, but how they view themselves within the institution. I had a conversation that will show up with Jenny Frederick from Yale. And Jenny has a very large center. And their center is very different than other centers because of some of the things that they serve. And in some ways, it's very similar. And I think that Jenny has a really good perspective on how the pieces fit together and how she's able to support faculty. And I compare it to my center, which pre-pandemic, there was two of us. And one was a graduate student. And now we've grown some where we have like 6 or 7 people, depending on how you count. But we're still pretty broad, the way you described. We're sort of generalists across the campus because we're not that big. But I think that there's great value in hearing from talking to someone like you at an institution like Stanford, and talking to people like Jenny, or talking to people like Carol Horii, who is at a small place and does things a little differently, because you get ideas and you see perspective and you understand institutional barriers are different depending on where you are. So I think that's great. And your career's been really interesting because you went from Horii, which is a small place, to Caltech, which was a very heavy science place, to Stanford, which has more of a broad mission than I think Caltech does. So I think that's great and really good for you to stay vital in your career.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been, again, like many of the folks you're talking with, there are twists and turns. It's interesting to look back. I think I have wanted to be places where I could make a contribution, where I could make a difference, where there was like a real perceived need and where I felt like there was a fit with something I could bring to that endeavor, to that need, with this kind of bigger picture of the enormous job that we have and the trust that we have of our students, of their families, of our communities in higher education to really fulfill the promise.
Yeah. So tell me just a little bit about your current role at Stanford and a little bit about your center. How big are you? How are you positioned within the institution? Where do you sit within sort of the org chart, that kind of thing?
Sure thing. Yeah. So the Center for Teaching and Learning at Stanford is one of the older centers in the U.S., not the oldest, which is in Michigan, but we're actually coming up on a 50th anniversary in the next few years. So the center is a little over 20 people, right around 20. A few of those are folks who mostly sit within a school or department and spend part of their time with us. Those are lecturer consultant roles and are important to our partnerships with the departments and the disciplines. And otherwise, the center has three big components. We are literally a center for teaching and learning. I think some centers might have that name, but we do support teaching. So we're working with faculty, teaching assistants, people who would like some teaching related professional development, perhaps for future careers as well. That's one of our main internal groups. A second focuses on student learning. So we offer directly for students workshops on academic skills, one-to-one academic coaching, and run a large amount of academic peer tutoring in groups related to some of the larger, especially courses, introductory courses, and one-on-one. And so train those undergraduate, especially undergraduate, but also graduate peer tutors in that work. And the third group that we have internally is the Academic Technology Solutions Lab, which is tasked with being a little bit on the cutting edge of what's kind of coming up, what the trends are in academic technology and educational technology, and really on partnering with courses, with faculty, also to support student learning directly in implementing those technologies. We don't run the whole learning management system. That's another group. And it's a really nice partnership, I think, to be able to try out new technologies, right, to pilot, to kind of get them into use and really think about the educational application and the integration with the rest of the learning environment. And then as things become more enterprise scale, right, we partner to make sure that they get integrated into the learning management system and the full suite of educational tech offerings.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. And I actually like that model a lot because one of the things that happens at a lot of institutions is that the teaching center may be telling faculty one thing about how students learn, and an academic support center might be telling students slightly differently things. And I think having strong collaboration between those offices or having them within one office is a nice way to ensure that there's a unitary voice spoken across campus that's supportive of the research and teaching and learning and kind of the effective ways of doing it. So I really like that model. And the academic technology piece, I think, is really important as more and more faculty are relying on academic technology. So that's a nice sort of marriage of three different centers. And you report to the provost?
We dually report to the vice provosts for undergraduate education and graduate education.
Okay.
Administratively, we sit a little bit more in the vice provost for undergraduate education, which is a larger overall unit, a little bit more infrastructure for things like budgets and those necessary items to keep ourselves afloat. But otherwise, it really is a dual report because, of course, we're working directly with both undergraduate and graduate students across the university. We're working with faculty who are teaching both undergraduates and graduate students across the university as well. And one other thing I think is just interesting to point out is, of course, we're a robust university with, many schools, including specialized schools, professional schools in business and education, in medicine and law. And then there's kind of half of the schools have undergraduate programs and half are only graduate professional. So we do have sibling centers located in some of the schools, faculty development, educational development, centers for teaching. And we work closely with them and actually have kind of an infrastructure for collaboration across the university called the Teaching Commons, which revived during the pandemic. It had been kind of an initiative, and then it had taken a long nap. And as we spun up to support, teaching in some new ways during the pandemic, that came back online and is now this overarching kind of umbrella initiative to connect those different areas, and has some really deep collaborations, communities of practice, and some events that really pull people in from all of those different areas.
That's great too. And when you're a big institution like that, I think that actually really makes sense, so that you do have that kind of support, and the needs are different. And I think having conversations are really helpful, but also the needs of some. So we're a small school, but we have very, very, what's the right word? They are very tightly controlled curricula within some of our professional programs, physical therapy, physician's assistantship, et cetera. And their needs are different. Their needs are just different. During the pandemic, trying to help create labs to support the physician's assistant students was more of a challenge than creating a lab to support biology. And so we become jack of all trades. You have infrastructure in place. So I think that's just terrific. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to come back to your career at the end. But I'd like to just get a feel for some of the things that you have done in your career that you think had a really profound impact on student learning, or things that you do in your current job that you think just work. Because one of the things I like to do in this conversation with people is to hear some of the programming or some of the initiatives that they think were really good. Because people in this field are incredibly generous about sharing. And I think this is yet another way to share out some of our ideas. So just something that you think has been really good.
Yeah, I want to put forward kind of a big idea for educational development, and then give you a couple examples of that.
Great.
The big idea is positioning the work of working with faculty, of educational development, where it needs to be within the university. And so one very concrete example of that is some of the work that I had done at Caltech prior to coming to Stanford, where the center that I launched and led for almost a decade worked with the vast majority of faculty on campus. So we ended up working with, almost everybody, vanishingly small non-participants over time. And that work was very much aided by figuring out what mattered in terms of the academic community, where people saw themselves, where people saw their colleagues, where people wanted to engage, and putting some of those conversations in that spot, which might be 4 p.m. on Thursday in physics and astronomy, and it might be Tuesday at 3 in chemistry and chemical engineering. But I think by placing conversations there, so literally just calling people up or emailing and saying, I think you have this seminar series, and I know we have this colleague who's done some great work on teaching from such and such a university. Do you think we could bring them in to that series? Usually the answer is yes, if you get ahead of it enough, because people are trying to fill up those slots and don't mind someone else helping out with one of the airfares, right? Or programming around that. That worked really well. If we think about what it takes to really make change, people need to, there's some models for this that I won't cite correctly, right? But people need to get interested, have their attention captured, some awareness. They need to then get curious enough to kind of make an investment, right? To actually do something, to take some action. And then there's probably a phase of like sustained learning and application with support that needs to happen for that to become a more sustainable practice that gets adopted for the long haul. So it doesn't take any energy to show up at 4 p.m. on a Thursday or Tuesday or whatever, get the cookies and coffee, right? And hear something fascinating about teaching. By being ready as a center to kind of capture that attention and channel it into something deeper, whether that's a follow-up consultation or whether it's a short course that's going to help them with the kind of course design or an institute or something like that to really apply it to their work. And then having the kind of longer term recognition and opportunities to build and further connect. When you look at that whole life cycle, but really starting with, okay, where do we need to be and how do we position the work where it needs to be? I think that's a big idea that I would share. And I think at Stanford, so I've only been here for a short time and would not take credit at all for this kind of work, but very similarly, there's an initiative right now adopted by the Faculty Senate to have capstone experiences for every undergraduate. And very similarly, the center has stepped forward to be a facilitator and to help support the implementation of that work. So we've just launched the first of the capstone experience design institutes and had multiple departments participating there, and we'll continue that work. But I think you get the principle, right? It's like, where we need to be, let's be where the people need it and want it and are ready to have that conversation. And then from there, folks in educational development form great relationships. The work itself is engaging. It's typically very helpful. And then we start to generate, a larger community and a community that sticks with the work for the longer term.
Yeah, we had a conversation before we started recording this about this topic. I think this is great. And I think what you said is really powerful to me. And that is a really well-positioned center is, and I hate these words now because everyone overused them during pandemic, but we're nimble and we're able to identify the needs of the faculty and the students by listening and being present with them to know what needs need to be filled and then helping fill those needs. And your point about interacting with so many faculty, that's really powerful. You leave faculty with a good impression in the meeting, and they are more likely to come to you with other questions that they might not have approached someone about before that will lead to better student learning outcomes. And so in my mind, what you're doing is what I consider to be one of the most important things about faculty development, is that's relationship building. It's building relationships with the people that you can work with that's going to essentially flow through to the student learning experience. And I think you've done it beautifully. And I was chuckling when you said, there's no reason not to email or call. We're a small enough campus. Cassandra, I went and knocked on doors and said, "Hey, I'm Chris. I'm the new center director. How you doing? Can I buy you a cup of coffee?" And
I've done it too. Yep, for sure.
And it works, right? People are willing to talk, and I think that that's really valuable. So I love that. I love that that's what you're doing, and I love that that's having that kind of impact. It had it at Caltech, and I think given who you are and your passion for this, you'll be able to do these kinds of things. The capstone experience is a great way to have an inroad because it's already been approved by the Senate. Now you're just here like, you have this problem. Guess what? We can help. That's a really great place to be, where you can provide the support for things that faculty are dealing with. So I just think that's great. I want to go to the other side and ask you if there's anything that you've experienced in your career as an academic or faculty developer, educational developer, where it seemed like it was a really good idea and it just didn't do what you thought it might do when you worked with faculty.
So again, I might just kind of twist the question a little bit and give you a one that's both positive and also still just a little puzzling.
Great.
Right. And I think that for me, and again, across several settings, has been the work that we're all doing in educational development on inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And I've approached this in a few different ways, and I think they're all important. Where I've seen more success in getting people to engage so far has been when it's a little hidden. And I don't think that's a good thing, ultimately. When the work on inclusive teaching isn't the headline, but it's embedded. So yes, we're embedding that work in everything that we do. It's always a part, whether we're talking about whether we're leading a course design institute, a short course for faculty on pedagogy, a longer experience, that is at the foundation, and it's been at the foundation in multiple settings that I've been in. What I have noticed is when we do put it as the headline, we are not yet seeing as much of an uptake to that, as much of a willingness. Now, the folks who see the headline and are there are very much invested and ready to do the work. And so one of the very powerful things that I'm seeing happening at Stanford is through some of the project work that we're able to support through some funding, and especially when we were able to support multi-role teams and deep collaborations between faculty and students, both undergraduate and graduate. And we're seeing that through our acronym in our setting is IDEAL, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access in a Learning Environment. That's kind of our Stanford larger set of initiatives. So our IDEAL pedagogy program has some project teams that have done just enormous, fantastic, really important change work in their departments through those kind of collaborations. And then we have also just an amazing group of graduate student leadership in inclusive teaching fellows, lit fellows, who again are working with faculty, with their departments, and incorporating some fantastic changes. So changing the way that teaching assistants are initially trained and engage with inclusive teaching very early in their careers, creating new courses in their departments with faculty participation, changing aspects of courses and curriculum on a variety of content area topics, right? To really embed inclusive teaching and learning very deeply in the content as well as in the methods. And at the same time, when we put out a call for proposals, we don't get the huge response that I'd like to see. And so I think it's a part of a bigger culture change question. I think we need to keep doing both. We need to keep embedding the work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we need to keep naming it as the headline. And I'd like to start to have those headline moments be more visible, be more well subscribed. And I think it circles back to that question that maybe we haven't quite found the right places to position those headline opportunities, the way to communicate them, the way to connect them with larger institutional initiatives and priorities. And so that to me is the work there. The programs themselves are deeply impactful and transformative, but we need to get those kind of entry points to be maybe a little bit more diverse, embedded, connected than they currently are.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting point, and as you were talking, I kept thinking about the fact that I suspect that most faculty would say similar things, or developers would say what you said, and that is, if you highlight that this is something on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it does have an impact on the kinds of turnout you get, and it's easier to do it when it's something that's part of it. And I started to think, because I'm a psychologist, right? So this is what I do. Why? And in some measure, and I'm trying to come up with an analog to it, is it that it is something that impacts your life both in the classroom and in your regular life? Is that the reason that people are concerned about it? I don't know, but it's a really important issue, and one that I know within the organization of POD, which is one of the last things I wanted to talk about, there's a lot of conversation about it and a lot of initiatives within POD that have been working towards trying to figure out ways to help increase access and increase representation and increase voices. And I think that the work needs to continue to happen, But as we continue to do the work, it's important for us to recognize that this is incredibly complex and nuanced. And there's so many small and large issues that come into play. It's really going to be one of those things that our centers are going to be wrestling with, I think, for many years. And I think that, and I brought up POD, I think that one of the things that you see in POD is a really strong feeling that this is central to the mission of the organization. And for the psych session people who don't do faculty development full-time, POD is the professional organizational developers. It's the organization for people who do the kinds of work that we do. And I think they've done a really nice job, but there's just more work to be done. And I know that you spent a year as the president of the organization, and you got to see all of the initiatives and all of those pieces. I just wonder if you can comment just briefly on your presidential year and some of the things that you think were really good that you saw during your presidential year, and things that you think are going to continue to be topics of discussion within POD.
Yeah, so rewinding a little bit, my presidential year was back in definitely 2018, because I worked on the strategic plan, right? So it was probably 2018 to 2019, and then 19 to 20, I was the past president. There's that 3-year rotation in the executive group for the three presidents. So I know you're on the strategic planning committee, Chris, so I'd love to hear how things are rolling out. One of the things about that organizational structure, it's wonderful to have the opportunity to train into the role, to be in the role, and then to support the next continuity, right? The next people stepping into that role. And when it's over, we kind of say bye and step away. And I also stepped away maybe a little bit more in that moment because of some, other things happening in just life in general. So being part of the strategic planning group was really important to me. It was a big thing that I spent my time on. I was so pleased with the kind of hard conversations that the organization had. Very much not the end of that, to tease apart. And in particular, I very much remember a series of conversations thinking about the organization's values, which name, I have it in front of me, which names equity as a value. And the realistic goal for this next 5-year period, which wasn't equity, because I think the organization, we recognized that we weren't going to get there, that there was still so much work to do on diversity, just on who's part of the work in higher education, about the inequities in opportunity. Those inequities are built upon inequities in faculty work, in attainment of doctoral degrees, which are all common pathways into the field of educational development, even master's degrees. So our work is also higher education's work, right, to really impact those inequities. And the organization had a lot of work to do on inclusion. And I think the POD network, for folks who have been to the conferences, feels different than an academic conference. And in some ways is very welcoming and open in terms of sharing resources. And in some ways can feel a little bit like a club. People know each other, and who have been in the roles for a long time. People who have been in the roles for a while tend to be white. There's more women in those roles. It hasn't been a very diverse, in terms of demographic backgrounds, profession. And so naming that work clearly, right? Owning that work is work to be done, and embedding the goal to make a substantial difference with the strategies, the expenditures of the organization, where the funds going, where are people spending their time, across the kind of areas of work for that strategic plan, I think is a good first step. And there's going to be a lot more work to do. But as I understand it, and this kind of began when I was still in the executive group, but the organization's working with a firm to really lead a full audit on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know folks who are involved in that work, but again, I've respectfully left it to leaders who are ready to take that on I faced some other challenges, and I'm excited to see what emerges. So I'm coming back now to the conferences as a member to see what's up and to see what new things are happening.
Yeah, well, that's great, and I appreciate your candor on that. I'll leave you with one last question as our time is coming up here, but I'd like to know if you have any thoughts on it could be either higher ed in general or our discipline or our profession as educational developers over the next 5 to 10 years. And I want to couch that with, there are books and papers and conversations about the long-term impact the pandemic had on how higher education is going to operate. And I'm just curious if you have any sort of thoughts or insights into the way things might change or the way things might revert back to the way they were, or just in general. And of course, this is all prognostication that may not come true, but I'm just sort of curious. I think you have a lot of experience. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's been, even leading up to the period that we now call the pandemic of today, more work to understand and work on a systemic level toward change, so that rather than isolating teaching is over here, training is over here, or professional development, reward structures are somewhere else, and we're kind of tackling each of these pieces, and then we're doing this in different disciplines, right, in silos. The understanding that no, the pieces are connected here, and we need to be thinking about how we nudge and push and pull the system that leads to our educational outcomes and educational quality. We need to be doing that in a coherent way. And so I've been involved with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's roundtable on systemic change in undergraduate STEM ed for a few years now. That group, other groups, there's the Accelerating Systemic Change Network, looking at, again, systemic change in higher ed. You can look at different consortia, organizations linking universities, Council of Independent Colleges, Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, AAC&U, AAU. There's a number of these organizations I think are all moving toward this systemic lens on change. Now we have a pandemic, and I think that has heightened as we're seeing the Great Resignation, as people are demanding actual equity from institutions and organizations, as students are questioning the value of education, the format of education. I think that's heightened questions that were already there, and that the solutions really have to be those ones that do link the different pieces. And that's where I know you've talked to a number of people who have kind of the center director piece, and then the institutional piece where they're serving on committees, where they're kind of participating with vice provosts and kind of cross school, cross area endeavors. That's important because it's there where we get to some of the systemic pieces where we figure out, like, okay, if over in our corner, we're going to work with students in a particular way, and we're going to work with instructors in this way, we need to know that over there, maybe it's student affairs, maybe it's residential, maybe it's how we're supporting commuter students, maybe it's how we're thinking about transfers, that we're all on the same page. And then if we're thinking about how instructors start, how they progress through their careers, right? How they're rewarded. That is all a coherent picture as well, ideally, that gives people license and time and resources to do that work for students and on behalf of students and with students. So That's both my hope and my prediction, because I think we're poised to do it, is that we don't forget that systemic piece, that we resist the urge to silo and separate this important work.
Yeah, I think that's great and beautifully articulated, Cassandra. I really appreciate that, because I do think it's a call for us to consider that our disciplines are really important to us. We investigate them as a function of, inherent interest we had before, but it's not enough. For higher ed to succeed, we need to talk, we need to communicate, we need to be open. And in some ways, and I'll be honest and a little snarky, we need to ask our faculty and administrators and our student affairs professional colleagues and everyone else to do what we ask students to do. And that is to collaborate and to think across different boundaries and to be creative in the way they solve problems. I think that's going to continue to lead us down a path of a better future for higher education. So thanks for that answer. I want to add one more thing, and then we'll tie this up. I said this before, and I'll say it again. I wanted to thank you and Martin Springborg for one of my favorite books that I've had come out in higher education in the last X number of years. It's been a while, called What Teaching Looks Like, Higher Education Through Photographs. For those of you out there who have not looked at it yet, we'll actually put a link to it in the notes for this episode. I encourage you to look at it. It's a beautiful portrait of what teaching looks like, both in words and pictures, and I encourage you to take some time and really sit with it. I've gone through the pictures a number of times. I've read the text, and it's beautiful. It's the only word I come back to. So I really want to thank you and Martin for putting this out there. It really is lovely, and thanks for coming and spending some time with me today. I really enjoyed this conversation tremendously, and I appreciate your insight in the work you do for educational developers.
Chris, thank you. It's been a delight to talk with you. I'm so glad that the book has had an impact. We're definitely hoping that it engages folks in a very different way than our conversation today, and then a lot of the other work that we do in really the deeper why behind that important educational effort that you and I and our many, many, many colleagues and our students put in and show up with to institutions really across the board. So thank you. It's been a great conversation today.
Thanks, Cassandra. Take care.